Welcome to another broadcast of MindYourHousecast.com. I know you were sitting on the edge of your chair and couldn't wait to get back for this next broadcast, and at least maybe a few of you anyhow. A lot of you said, enough of that. But that's okay. I hope I tweaked a little interest somewhere in your psyche about energy and the importance of energy, and maybe looking at a more distinct or definitive definition. I just have noticed over the years that the word energy is kind of thrown every which way and applied to all kinds of things. And in many cases, I'm sure that the person making the comments really wasn't quite sure what energy really is. Now, as you probably will recall if you went back to my early broadcast, the word energy, or the definition, at least from physics, from my early days of studying physics, and I think it's pretty well still the basic definition, is the capacity to do work, which means energy causes things to happen. The big issue is, of course, that there's different kinds of energy, and energy in a reckless way can be very devastating, meaning uncontrolled or not directed. And if you've noticed a strike of lightning up close, you would know what I'm talking about. I'm sure that the people that had the house or the tree or the body, as the case might be, that got struck with lightning really didn't want it to hit them like that. They probably didn't mind seeing it. My closest encounter with it was probably 50 to 75 feet away, and it was like a major explosion. It hit a tree, and there was a cloud of bark, and splinters of the tree went through the air, and then the tree started burning. But I still remember the loudness of it. I knew it was loud, but I never could fathom how loud it could be till you're that close to it. But that energy could and did perform some type of work and destroy the tree. However, there's another factor involved with energy, and if you get back to the definition that we originally gave you and the title that we gave you of the first of these three broadcasts, we were talking about energy, information, and life. So we're talking about the specific application of the capacity to do work with life as directed by information. And of course, that's the other factor, is that information, in order to do desired work, controls information to direct it. And the direction comes from a lot of different methodologies. In the case of the body, we have a control system, unconscious to us, that directs all of the energetic happenings that are going on in the body. It directs the breakdown of worn out cells. It directs and disposing of those. It directs the rebuilding of new cells. It directs actually the making of more energy via the mitochondria. And so all that would not happen if there were not some informational coordination that's directing how those take place. And the information is important. If you think of the term information, comes from the word inform, which means to form in. And so what it does, it somehow controls, regulates, and forms what energy does. Now, if you get into quantum physics, as we've mentioned earlier, and you talk about matter, matter is not a solid object as we think of. Now, it feels solid to us because it's held together by very, very powerful energy sources that make it not easy to penetrate. Now, we can drive a sharp object into it, like a nail or a knife or a hatchet, with other force that's even greater, or other energy that overcomes that. And for a while we can interpenetrate. But there is a huge space that's present but not easily penetrated because of the power of attraction that's holding it all together. And if you go a little bit deeper, then you realize that, well, matter really is made from, many of the physicists feel, light entrapped in an energy field as is directed by information. In other words, if the information isn't there, the energy could go crazy and the matter would have no specific form. It would be like an amorphous blob. And so it's that information that makes it possible. But even information, it's interesting, has an energy cost also to produce it. Now, if you really want to get into this in detail, because behind information and so forth, you have something called intent, which is like the writing of the program of information for the direction of the energy to carry on work. Now, I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but if you give it a lot of thought, I think you'll see that there's a certain rationale there. So that means that we have to intend for something to happen, and when we do, we then direct information to become the controller and director of the movement of energy. And if you think about it, it has tremendous implications, much beyond what we're talking about here, other than the fact that it's a good explanation of things like miraculous happenings, where a strong enough intent produces enough information to move enough energy to make a dramatic sudden change. Now, in quantum physics, that would be saying you're raising the amplitude of the wave of probability to such a high level that it collapses into a reality. Now, that'll give you something to think about. If you go back to the book by Fred Alan Wolf that I was talking about before on taking the quantum leap and get a basic understanding of energy, and quantum concepts and how it involves energy, I think you will find it fascinating. And he does a good job of putting it in a form that is easy to, let's say easier, to understand a little bit about the concepts. It takes a while. It takes what I call a rethink, because we're brought up to see the world in a certain way. We think it's a certain type of thing, and that this is the way the world is what we're visually seeing every day. And we kind of ignore what I call the little contradictions that occur along the way. We kind of ignore those. And as I mentioned before, at the turn of the century, between the 1800s and 1900s, one of the prominent world physicists made the comment that really that was not a field for young men at that time, he said, to get into, because pretty much everything that there is to be known has already been discovered. And so all we have to do is just to tweak it a little bit, and we'll know everything there is to know about physics. So it would really be a waste of time to go into the field since everything's been discovered anyhow. Now, talk about a tremendous understatement. Two things about that. One is he said, well, there's only a few things. One is the dark matter paradox. And another small thing he mentioned that he said those need to be ironed out, and they will soon. And then we'll know everything that there is to know about physics. And of course, it wasn't long till quantum physics broke into the scene, and the theory of relativity of Einstein hit, first the special theory and then later the general theory. So all of a sudden, we were back in kindergarten again. And that's, of course, like the famous statement that was made in 1968 by the Surgeon General of the United States before the U.S. Congress, when he said, "Gentlemen, you can close the books on infectious diseases. They felt that they had learned enough about antibiotics that no matter what came along, we can take care of the problem. And now, of course, we find that that was another one of those tremendous understatements. Just as soon as you think you know something, and that's what I've found in my own life, as soon as you think you know something, all of a sudden you find that a door opens and you're standing at the bottom of a stair of a whole new realm of information. And here you are back, in a sense, in kindergarten. So if your mind is open, if you're constantly exposing yourself to new information, information directs energy, which directs movement, and of course in the terms of thinking, it directs change. I think that this is probably one of the most important things you can engage in is to understand this. Now, especially as it relates to the human body and our life. Now, I mentioned before a lot of different books, but if you were only, out of all the books that I've mentioned, to get very few that would give you a pretty good start in understanding what energy is all about, what life is all about. One would be The Basic Code of the Universe. I've mentioned it before, it's on the list, called The Science of the Invisible in Physics, Medicine, and Spirituality, written by Massimo Citro, MD from Italy. And they, I mentioned before, have formed a research organization of a group of doctors, and they've been researching all kinds of things as it relates to health and illness. And they have gotten a pretty good handle on a lot of things and proving a lot of things. You know, the big problem was with a lot of the things of natural medicine is that you could observe the effects, but you could not prove by objective studies or detection the actual mechanism. And so because of that, a lot of people were very, very negative to natural health. Now, if on the other hand, if you look at what they have found out, they have, first of all, developed and made use of some very sophisticated equipment that can measure things that weren't even measurable before. And so now they've got a good handle on things like homeopathy. Is there anything to it? Is there a way to measure whether it's effective or not, and to measure whether it's present after you dilute beyond a certain level? Is it actually anything there, or is there something that works, or is it pure placebo? Now, of course, when you give it to animals and infants and you get tremendous results, I don't think that's placebo. I would have, and within the definition of placebo, I don't believe that that's a case of placebo, and yet we've watched it over the years work extremely well in both of those, as well as adults, and get good results. So I've known, when I have to admit, when I first heard about homeopathy years and years back, my first response is, boy, that sounds kind of hokey. I wonder if it's really anything to that stuff. And I'm sure other people do the same thing when they first hear about it. But if you want some good scientific documentation, this book is extremely good. I mentioned one of the major researchers of energy as it relates to the body was Dr. Robert Becker, MD. Big researcher, and several years ago he wrote the book The Body Electric, Electromagnetism and the Foundation of Life. Extremely good book to read. He did a lot of documentation, so that's two good books. The third I mentioned many times. I mentioned again, Energy Medicine, The Scientific Basis by Dr. James Oshman, PhD, tremendous researcher. This and his second book, Energy Medicine in Therapeutics and Human Performance, really has a tremendous amount of information, a lot of it about energy, both good and bad. In other words, all energies have the potential to go a lot of different directions, and being exposed to the wrong kinds of energies can be very disruptive to the system. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about it, but there is an author by the name of Fred Gallo, Gallo, has taken the field that started with Dr. Roger Callahan several years ago on thought field therapy and developed over time something called energy psychology. And so this is one of his books called Energy Diagnostic and Treatment Methods. And then he has another huge book on energy psychology. So that is the application of it to the psychological side. And then ultimately, of course, they all come together in body-mind medicine anyhow, but to a degree there's a little separation in terms of the way they're studying it and the types of people who utilize or make use of it. Those are some of the basic, if you only could have a few books, they would be very good to have. Then I did mention Vibrational Medicine by Dr. Richard Gerber, which also is a very good book, but if you're having trouble with too many books, then the ones I just mentioned would be good. But if you were to add one more, the one by Gerber is called Vibrational Medicine, and it's about subtle energy therapies. Now, we've mentioned about some different types of energies, and I suppose we should talk about that slightly, is that there are different types of energy out there in terms of the way we describe them. Now, in the final picture, they all come back together, but on a temporary or a way of studying basis, it's probably not bad to separate them. You know, because somehow all of these have to do with something happening because of something, and depending on how you define it, it's kind of interesting. There's only one form that comes out of even physics, but it's very subtle to the point that you're having a hard time even measuring it, if at all. There's maybe some very astute types of measurement systems that might pick it up, and that is very difficult because it's something called scalar energy, and if you get into the studies, you're going to run into scalar. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people throw it around, the term scalar, and say, oh, well, this makes use of scalar energy. Now, the nice thing about it, you can't prove it one way or the other, and so they can get away with saying whatever they want. You can call it anything you want. That there's scalar energy. Now, there really is, but here's the problem. To produce scalar energy, there's a couple of unique things about it. Number one is that if you bring two electromagnetic fields. Now, an electromagnetic field is a field created by electrons moving through a wire or some conductor. And if you bring two of those together in a way that they are the same but of opposite polarity, or phase, I guess phase is the better way to do it, but what happens if you remember electricity, you have what are called a sine wave, which goes up and down, above and below a zero line, so it goes up. And we use that in our electricity. If it's 60 cycle, it means every second it goes to a peak on the plus side and a peak on the negative side and back to zero again. And one cycle is also now today called a hertz. And so that has a phase to it. The phase being that at one point half of it is above the line, positive, and the other half is below the line. Now, if you take another one and align it with that, and another conductor, that would create another electromagnetic field, but you shift the phase. In other words, when this one is going up to its peak, which in our case is like 110 volts positive, the other one is going 110 volts negative at exactly the same time, which is called in-time phase inversion. And when that happens, they neutralize each other and it flatlines. And then when it goes the opposite way, the one that was positive goes negative and the one that was negative goes positive, but still in phase. it neutralizes again. So bottom line is you're running energy through both of those conductors, but they're canceling each other out. If you put a compass up, for example, or a magnetic field detector, you detect no electromagnetic field. It's zeros. But there's another energy, or another, it's hard to say. So I almost think it's like a field. Another energy called scalar energy that is left when you remove the electromagnetic component. Now, all of these have to do with movement and direction, but this scalar field of energy is non-directional. It's called a non-vector concentration gradient field. So it's almost like you have zones of strong one way and strong the other, but you can't put a meter on it and measure it, and that makes it difficult. But somehow those scalar fields are involved in effects, and there are mathematics that calculate scalar fields. But as I say, I think a lot of people who are doing something and they know you can't measure what they're doing, they say, well, this is a scalar field. And of course, right away, and sometimes they call it a scalar wave, but see, that's a misnomer also in my mind, because it's not a wave. It is a standing energy concentration gradient that's at a very subtle but yet very effective level. And I think there's a tremendous amount needs to be discovered about that. But when you hear somebody throwing around the term a scalar wave, I have great difficulty that it's a wave, because it's not moving. Vector means that it has some direction, and it doesn't have any direction. It's just there. It's a concentration. So in that field there can be effects, but not the same effects as a moving field would have, like the flow of electricity producing electromagnetic fields. So that one is quite unique, and I think it's still kind of really fuzzy in terms of understanding, although I'm sure at some point we will come up with a method of measuring it. I have some ideas, but at this point I'm not sure. So again, when we talk about energy, just so that it kind of clarifies it for you, we're talking about the movement of electrons is a type of energy. Remember, the capacity to do work. Something's moving the electrons along, and they can carry out work. They can produce heat. If you did it in a, let's say, a stove burner, electric burner, the resistance of that moving through creates heat as a byproduct, and so we use that heat to cook with. So that's called electricity, but we have electricity in our body that moves through also because we have electrons moving. And so the movement of electrons is referred to as electricity. Now there's the movement of protons. And what is proton? It's the positive charge. It's like a hydrogen ion, and it carries positive charge. Now, most people don't think of it moving, but in the human body there are movements of protons through conductors of protons, and it's called proticity. Now, you don't read about that often, if ever. In fact, I dare say you probably have never come across the term unless you've read into some interesting books. Now, when I talk about Dr. Ashman, he does mention about proticity in his books on energy medicine. And proticity is very important because the movement of protons as well as the movement of electrons are involved in the body making energy. And what it does, when it makes energy, it's really creating molecules that high energies put into it to create the molecule, and when we utilize that and we break that molecule down, that energy is released in the capacity to do work. So it's important that that you kind of grasp that whole idea if you really want to understand how the body works. And so we have electricity and proticity. Now we know also that it appears that the protons like to move through what are called hexagonal structured water molecule chains or groups. So the body seems to have a preference for hexagonal structured water. Now, I know a lot of the scientists have done a lot of poo-pooing about it, but in recent years we've had some tremendous research come out that can show that yes, it's true, we do that. And in nature, for some reason, the hexagon is very important. Snowflakes are always hexagonal, even though they have tremendously different forms. Bottom line is they all are some type of a form of a hexagon. And so the water in the body, inside the cells, it's important that it be hexagonal, and the hexagonal groupings of water around certain fibers in the body that carry electrons carry protons. And in the mitochondria, the movement of protons and electrons, as I say, are involved in the making of energy via high energy phosphate bonds of a molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Now, those of you who have studied a little biochemistry, or even if you haven't, you've probably heard the term ATP, which are little battery molecules that are created by the mitochondria, and they're stored, and when we expend work by using energy to carry out work, we can deplete our energy pretty rapidly, and so those stored molecules come into play, and unless we really overdo it, then we exhaust our supply of ATP. Now we have to turn to something different, which is called fermentation type or glycolysis, which is another way of producing energy, not very efficient, and also produces a lot of lactic acid as a byproduct. So, and of course, if you've studied cancer or about cancer, you probably are aware of the fact that cancer cells produce energy primarily by fermentation and produce a lot of lactic acid as a byproduct. It's kind of interesting how this all comes together, and the more you study and look into it, the better it is. Now, the other factor is that making use of the movement of electrons, producing electromagnetic fields as opposed to natural magnets. Now, a natural magnet is like a bar magnet, or it could be different shapes, could even be a sphere as far as that's concerned. It just will have to make a north and south pole. So the permanent magnets are magnetic no matter what. Electromagnets are only producing magnetism when the electrons are moving, because when electrons move through a conductor, it produces an electromagnetic field that runs at a 90-degree angle to the actual movement of electrons. So without getting too technical about it, we have electromagnetic fields, and we can produce those otherwise. We can run current through a wire and produce an electromagnetic field around that wire. We can make it pulsed if we do pulse DC or we do AC. It's moving phase-wise and polarity-wise back and forth. And so we can do that too. And so we can make use of that. The body does it all the time. The brain, for example, produces a magnetic field, an electromagnetic field, that's detectable outside the skull. And for many years, we couldn't measure that, but along came a very sophisticated instrument called a SQUID device, which is a superconducting quantum interference device. That's where the term SQUID comes from. And what it does, it's almost like a helmet that you put over the head, and then you can actually measure the electromagnetic signals being given off by the movement of electrons in the brain. So it all has to do with the ability to measure and the sensitivity. Same thing with the fact that the body gives off photons, getting down to some of the very core stuff. It receives and emits photons. Well, the evidence was there, but the ability to measure it. Well, Dr. Popp and a group in Germany developed an instrument that's so sensitive that it can measure one single photon. And with that, they were able to prove that the DNA, for example, in the cells receive and emit photons. Photons, we have to get back to quantum physics. You know, it was actually Einstein that, again, way back, that he received a Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect, and that is that when a beam of light, which was considered up to that point to be purely electromagnetic waves, according to the work of Maxwell, who was an earlier physicist and mathematician, And so everybody knew that light was electromagnetic waves of some sort. It's a different frequency than, say, sound waves, but it is a wave. And all of a sudden, they realized that when a light beam hits certain metals, it will knock electrons out of orbit, and that's called the photoelectric effect. And all of a sudden, they're saying, well, how can that be? If it's purely an electromagnetic wave, how could it collide with electrons and knock them out of orbit? And so Einstein said, oh, well, this is the way it works. That there are some times that the wave, the electric wave of light, electromagnetic wave, acts like a particle. It's like a packet, and that's where this quantum thing started coming in. So here we have the electromagnetic, what used to seem like waves, now under certain conditions acting like a particle. And so it's like these little BBs in a string is a wave of light, but yet they have the capability of behaving like a particle. And so there was some special experiments set up, but we don't even have time to go into all that, but I'm just saying, and giving you that information as an inducer for you to go and look more about it. But anyhow, that all of a sudden created a dichotomy, because how can light be a particle and a wave, or one or the other? Or is it like both at the same time? So it got kind of confusing, but a lot of studies have indicated, well, maybe it's a packet of waves. But the bottom line is, we don't know. But some information puts the energy together to make it appear as a solid. And of course, getting back to what I said earlier, we're talking about all the matter has in some way entrapped energy and makes it appear as a particle. And the thing that makes that happen is information. And so the question is, where does the information come? In humans, we can do it consciously or unconsciously. We can provide information to make things happen. And that information then directs the movement of electrons, protons, whatever. Okay, and so then we have the subtle energies. I'm just giving you some of the different ones. And the subtle energies are the ones that are very difficult to measure. Things like laying on of hands are very difficult to measure in terms of an instrument, and probably a squid set up right could measure some of that. But anyhow, something transfers and people get better. I mean, it's now been established. There's a whole section of nursing called, developed by Dolores Krieger, called healing touch. And so these nurses found out if they put their hands on people who were very sick and had difficult problems, that a lot of times pain was relieved and healing started to occur, and all these things happened because of it. So that was an application in the field of medicine, but they refer to those energies as subtle. And another realm that they refer to the subtle is when the interconnectedness of people, either their minds or parts of their body, in another location. And if you remember the Secret Life of Cells, we've mentioned that book before, and it has to do with the fact that they remove cells, white cells, from the saliva of a doctor and took it a few miles away, and they set it up in a very, very sensitive measuring unit that could measure if those cells react. And then they did things to emotionally provoke the doctor, who was a few miles away from his white cells. And when they had the timers set up that were synchronized so that they could tell that at the time that he became disturbed, whether or not the cells reacted at that very same time. And sure enough, there was a correlation. So there was some informational transfer via some form of energy, and so those sometimes have been referred to as subtle energies. But they did it many miles away, and every time something happened to him, there was a reaction in his cells in this other location at exactly the same time. And so that connection of energy, whatever it is referred to as subtle energy. Getting back to what I said earlier, that's subtle is one of the forms. Now, there's just one other thing I'll throw in real fast related to energy, and that is resonance. Resonance means that when two resonators, meaning something that produces waves, are put close to each other, if one is vibrating, then the other will start vibrating at the same frequency. And of course, I'm convinced that homeopathy and a lot of things contain resonances that react with the body at the right time with the right problem, and helps your body correct it. And there's a lot of study that came out of Germany, especially out of the realm of homotoxicology, but it's way beyond what we can cover today. In fact, we could have hours and hours just on the basics of energetics, period. So I mentioned that energetics has been applied to medicine, and we mentioned Gerber's book, which has a lot of it to do with medicine. We mentioned the work of Oshman in energy medicine, and we mentioned that it also has been applied to psychology. And so the utilization of somehow either manipulating or controlling or enhancing energy has a lot of effect on the emotions and eradicating old bad energies, negative energies tied into a memory that are incapacitating to someone, like post-traumatic stress and some other types of things, that those can be eradicated or neutralized out. That's what came up and became known as energy medicine. And there's different ways of doing it. Some of you may have run across the idea of tapping already, where you tap certain acupoints, and that in some way manipulates or moves the energy in a way that can neutralize, when you're thinking about this negative thought, it can neutralize the energy off of it, so you now can think of whatever it is without it being traumatic to you to think about. And so there's a whole realm of that. Started out with Dr. Roger Callahan. Again, we don't have time to go into all the details, but he created something years ago called, and it was a serendipitous discovery to a degree. I mean, he'd been studying about some things, but it just kind of all came together in one instance, and he was able to help somebody get rid of a phobia in just no time. So they call it, one of his books actually was called The 5-Minute Phobia Cure, and it worked extremely well. So that's something to look into again, and out of that developed something called Emotional Freedom Technique, which was by a gentleman by the name of Gary Craig, who studied with Callahan, developed his own approach. Now it's spread all over the world, and so you're going to run into this tapping idea. And one new variation now is, instead of tapping on a point, you just touch it, and then you breathe a certain way, and it's called TAB, touch and breathe. And so that's one of the newer applications of it. But it all has to do with, in some way, using information to alter, direct, stop, to start something to do with the movement of energy, which comes from the informational side of it, as we mentioned. So when you bring all that together, you have basic information about how the world works, the universe works, the human body works, the cell in the body works, the DNA works. It all utilizes these same principles. So I hope I've just given you enough of a start to provoke you into looking more into all of this, because, as I say, it could be tremendous in terms of we could do hours and hours and hours of it. Princeton had the project, and I think I mentioned to you before, if I didn't, called the PAIR Project, which was set up many years ago. It was the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Project under the Department of Engineering at Princeton University. And out of that, a book was written, which I also cited for you, but you might want to look up, written by two of the researchers at Princeton. It was called Margins of Reality, which is a very good book, written by Robert G. John, J-A-H-N, and Brenda J. Dunn, D-U-N-N-E. And now they have a later edition, I see, that came out in 2009. The original came out many years ago. They eventually closed down the PAIR Project, and the people who had worked at it for a long time formed another group called ICRL, International Consciousness Research Laboratories. And so the project is carried on. It's just no longer under the auspices of the engineering department at Princeton. And so they have done a lot of work. I see they've got a new book out called Quirks of the Quantum Mind. You can look up ICRL on the internet and get on their website and find out something about the organization. In fact, I think you can become a member of it and keep up with the things that are happening in these levels of research. And also Institute for Heart Math out of California, I've mentioned many times before. If you actually can become associated with them, just to register, or you can actually join it, and then there's a lot of perks, which means you can have access to a lot of free research papers that they do, and they're heavily involved in some of the research today too. So those are two good sources you can get to. I hope I've given you enough to arouse your interest and get you going, and as I say, there's just no end to all the information. I mean, I have stacks of books. I only have mentioned a few of them, like here's one called The Energy of Belief, Psychology's Power Tools to Focus Intention and Release Blocking Beliefs. And here's another one called Psychoenergetics. I work with a system out of Switzerland called Psychosomatic Energetics that works with treating the body, for no matter what it is, from the emotional side because of the energies of the emotions. So anyhow, I hope this will get you going. It was nice to be with you again, and we'll work on coming up with some exciting subject for the next project or the next broadcast. In fact, I have something in mind, something that I became involved with years ago, and then because of the untimely death of the originator, it kind of got put on the back shelf. Very powerful, good stuff, and I think we'll talk about that the next time. And it's commonly referred to as SAF, and I think you'll find that fascinating. It was nice to be with you again. Go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and peruse through the pages and look at all the books that are recommended, and we will have you in no time a genius in the realm of energetics and natural medicine. Until the next time, be healthy.